Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to, I promise you, the last lecture of the day. But there's 3 more tomorrow, and 3 more the next day, and 3 more the next day, so y'all got to hang in there. So I'm George Losey. You know enough about me that I don't have to tell you anything more about me. If you need to know anything more, just come and talk to me sometime. Diane and I love to have people sit and talk to us, so please do that. Today I'm going to talk about I'm not going to talk about the origins of David has taken care of a lot of this for me, and Dan, so I don't have to talk about how the oceans got there. You got that this morning from David. I do want to talk a little about currents and waves and about the resources of our ocean, but also the things that modern oceanography has revealed to us about our oceans that are so critical to understand what's going on our planet. Big surprise of the day, this is a Smithsonian Journeys lecture, spreading knowledge throughout the world. Now, the question I left you guys with last time. Marianas Trench, very deep piece of water, all the way down. Sea level does not remain constant over the trench. So you've got 2 choices now. How many think sea level goes down? Okay, a fair number of people have finally committed. How many think that sea level goes up? Okay, the majority say sea level goes up. Well, those of you who say sea levels go up, sorry. Now, to get all the points on this, you'd not only have to get the 50-50 chance correct, it goes down, but you'd have to be able to tell me why. On one previous ship about 2 years ago, somebody had the answer, and someone on this ship also had Are you here anywhere, the guy who had the correct answer? He's, shy. Okay, well, the answer is, in short, gravity. There are many logical ways to approach this, and if you asked me, without my already knowing it, I would have gotten this wrong, I promise you. In fact, the first 2 times I gave this, before I gave the lecture, I went back to the papers and read them again, just to make sure that I had gotten it right. The key is to understand gravity. Gravity is not just pulling down, gravity is pulling in a direction. It pulls in the direction of the greatest mass. So where's the greatest mass across here? The sides of the Marianas Trench, solid rock. The middle of the Marianas Trench, just water. So there's more pull toward the sides. That means water molecules are pulled on a vector, slightly sideways to the sides. And this, in fact, depresses sea level over the Marianas Trench. I've got some reference. Of those of you whose math says George is wrong, I'll give you the references. But I can also give you, this is satellite altimetry, as a satellite went over the top of the Marianas Trench and using radar pings off of the surface, that's the actual surface depth that they got. The change in surface depth can be well over 1 meter. So it's interesting that our old concept of the ocean like a giant bathtub. Okay, we had tides. And we know that goes back and forth. But other than that, everything will just even itself out. Well, it isn't that way at all. And we'll see more data on that in this lecture. Well, until recent years, there was a lot we did not know about the ocean. In fact, we were ignorant enough that we were able to consider the ocean as an endless resource and an infinite storage site for stuff that we didn't want. We could take stuff out of it, it would get replenished. We could put stuff into it. We'd never have to deal with it again. Well, we were incorrect. Now, we've been through enough of the formation of the oceans now. I don't think we have to go through that again. Just to realize that the continents were drifting apart, being pushed apart, and they still are being pushed apart and separating. But the oceans as we have them today, within our life, we're not going to notice any difference. You've also been, what I want to again emphasize, the current gyres in the ocean. In the northern hemisphere, going clockwise, southern hemisphere counterclockwise, except for that troublesome Mediterranean that has it all backwards for the northern hemisphere. I want to draw your attention once again, because it's so important, to what we call the Atlantic drift, which is warm water going up north and cooling off near the whoo-hoo. This thing's on wheels. Wow, I didn't know that, Dan. You should have told me. So it's going up north, warm water cooling. And you hear a lot about the garbage patch. Certainly there is a garbage patch in the Pacific. There's another garbage patch in the North Atlantic. There's also other smaller garbage patches that I'll show a bit of data on. But this is the stuff that we throw into the ocean, either on purpose or accidentally, and it's going to be there for a long, long time. If we look at the kind of stuff we're talking about, I'm not talking about milk jugs and plastic bags. Mostly, we're talking about little things like this. Now, these are myctophid fish. That's a real favorite food for the smaller ocean fish that are food for the bigger ocean fish. The thing is, they're about the same size as all these particles floating around. So things are eating the particles. If we look at the distribution, in this case, small microplastics up here, we've got each blue dot in this section to the right represents 10 billion pieces. So there are about 7.5 kilotons, so 7,500 tons of material floating around in these patches. And you can see they're not only the Pacific, it's also the Atlantic, North and South. Wherever there's a gyre, this stuff collects. The larger microplastics, these are about 1 to 5 millimeters. That's about the size of those white things I showed on the previous slide. And in this case, we've got about 28,500 tons floating around the ocean. The trouble is, both of these are just the right size to eat. So a very recent research paper went around looking at shellfish and fish gut contents. That is, what were the fish and shellfish eating, the fish and shellfish that are in the market that we're going to eat. Looking in the oceans off of Indonesia first, by far the majority were plastic fragments, little chips of plastic, about 5 millimeters. Second after that was little chips of foam. What was very surprising to me, the coastal waters of the United States, by far the majority of the material was fibers, microfibers. Microfibers from the microfiber clothing and cleaning cloths and everything that we love using in the United States. The difference between Indonesia and the USA, to me, was staggering. A much smaller amount of film-like plastics. And these other fragments and monofilaments common off of Indonesia, very uncommon relative to the others. What this means is the microfibers are ending up in us. That's what's happening. Some of this research, this was done, by the way, using Whirlpool washing machines, and they found, amazingly, that front-load machines were 10 times better at not tearing off microfibers. So if you're not using a front-load machine, you're contributing 10 times more microfibers to the environment than if you were using a front-load. I thought that was rather interesting. And Patagonia Clothing gladly donated all sorts of different kinds of clothing and microfibers for their research, which I thought was inspired, since some of the results were not exactly complementary to either company. Sea surface temperature. Again, you've seen this. We can download it every day from satellites that sense the infrared temperature of the surface of the ocean. Very critical for determining Earth's climate. And you know about all the warm water going up through the North Atlantic. Again, this Atlantic drift, warm water cooling as it goes north. Salinity of the ocean is relatively constant, but the Atlantic, again, being an outlier, that especially a contribution from the Mediterranean and the high salinity water in the North Atlantic compared to the North Pacific. And again, now we have this North Atlantic drift of high saline water. Now, last time I showed this slide, after the talk, I was asked, how come there's such high salinity off of Brazil, off of the Amazon River? And now I looked at this slide. So the question is this color here. Well, this color is hard to discriminate. Really what that color is way down here, 31 parts per thousand. So it is very low salinity, as it absolutely has to be, with the mouth of the Amazon River draining into the South Atlantic. So no worries on that one. And we've presented this before, this oceanic conveyor belt. The North Atlantic drift, all the warm, high saline water, it gets colder, it gets more saline, it sinks, travels right around the planet. Takes 500 to 1,000 years for it to circumnavigate our planet. So this North Atlantic overturning, there's no overturning in the North Pacific. One, it doesn't go far enough north, it's not saline enough to have this same phenomena there. Lucky for us, that's true. Now these are very slow currents. It's been calculated that if, in fact, we get a large amount of melting of the many of the ice caps in the Atlantic, of Greenland, of Iceland, if we contribute too much fresh water to this area, it could slow down or even stop this North Atlantic turnover. It's thought that this has happened in the past with the release of an ice dam in North America, releasing fresh water which doesn't get heavy enough to sink, slows down or stops the North Atlantic turnover. So the way this thing works is that the turnover again there, cold, heavy saline water sinks. Arctic melt lowers salinity and thus slows the sinking. What could happen if we get huge amount of melting of fresh water? Now, as you know, a floating ice cap can melt and not raise sea level, but it will lower the salinity of the surface water. What I'm going to show you next is a model, okay, of what could possibly happen 300 years after we stop the North Atlantic turnover. We end up with very cold water up here to the north, and the rest of the planet warming considerably if this turnover is stopped. I doubt the turnover is going to stop, but what it does show us is how important this is for the climate and the weather on our planet. It's a very critical part of us. If we did not know about it, we'd have literally no chance of generating models that predict what global climate change could bring about. So we got to understand the ocean. Now, wherever these currents, these gyres, especially if they pass through a constriction, they form eddies. One example, one of my favorites, is in Hawaii, the Ale Nui Haha Channel, which means wide stretch, bad water. Between the Big Island and Maui, as the water flows through the channel, eddies form. This is Eddy Loretta, and this is the temperature. What happens in an eddy is deep water is brought up to the surface. This is deep, cold water. It may have sunk in the North Atlantic 500 or 800 years ago. Now it gets sucked up to the surface. It is full of nutrients. So what happens is we get a cold patch of water. That patch of water is high in nutrients. This is chlorophyll count. If you're a fisherman, you keep track of these. That's where you want to go trolling off the Big Island. The water there should be rich with small fish eaten by bigger fish, eaten by bigger fish. There's some great eddies off the coast of Australia. The coral sea water to the upper right is much warmer than the more southern water, and there's a strong current that starts down the coast towards Sydney. The strong current doesn't make it all the way, but gyres break off from this. Gyres rotating like this going down the coast. If you saw one of my favorite movies, Finding Nemo, that's what Nemo's dad hooked a ride on to get down to Sydney, along with his good friend Dory. I thank you for reminding me of that, Dory, if you're here. So this is an example of what these eddies do off of Sydney. Now in this case, if this isn't temperature and it's not chlorophyll, it's sea level. The sea level between the center of that eddy and the center of an opposing eddy going the other direction is as much as 1.2 meters difference in sea level because of the presence of that eddy. So again, sea level, not a bathtub at all, but the difference in sea level due to colder water occupying less space than warm water. Another really interesting eddy, and Dan showed you the early explorers getting around these areas, and I really hand it to him because this is a rough sketch of the kind of currents on the east coast of Madagascar throwing off these eddies going like this. And these are drogue buoys. You put a buoy over the water, you follow where it goes, and they go willy-nilly all over the place. I'm told that many of the captains on the old square riggers really didn't like going through the Madagascar Channel because of the unpredictability of the currents. What this does, though, around the tip of South Africa is really beautiful. So we've got very warm water here in the south of the Indian Ocean, traveling to the east and finally up into the Atlantic. This is the feed that forms that whole conveyor belt. That goes into the South Atlantic, gets sucked up into the North Atlantic, the Gulf Stream, goes way up north and sinks back down again. But as it squeezes above the Southern Ocean, and the tip of Africa, all kinds of swirly things happen. So this is the temperature, and this one I love. That's chlorophyll. The deeper water that's brought up in these eddies, rich in nitrates, phosphates, iron, so you get a bloom of phytoplankton and, again, fish. But you also get some weird currents in this area. Now, I've been through there several times. I keep looking for I don't really want the big waves, but this is one area of the world where you certainly can get them. I imagine some of you have certainly been there. This is a sister ship to the Queen Elizabeth that we were alongside yesterday. And she's not actually getting very amused right there, I suspect. There was a little bit in the paper this morning about what is a swell, what is a wave. A swell being a wave essentially started by the wind, but now no longer being driven by the wind, driven by its own power. Well, what is the water molecules doing? Are those water molecules traveling from, let's say, the North Pacific to the South Pacific? No. What happens in a swell, the water molecules oscillate back and forth. So as the swell passes, the water molecules move, they form a tight bunch, and that's a high swell, and then they separate back out again. So unless you have a tsunami, these oceanic swells, the water doesn't really move along with the swell. Sound in the ocean. I'm sure you've heard one time or another about, let's say, the Navy sonar, and perhaps this is interfering with the well-being of marine mammals in the ocean. There's a lot of sound in the ocean. This is at 200 meters depth, and it's a 50 hertz sound. That's a very low frequency sound. And this is at the reddest areas there, that's 110 decibels. That's loud. That's like going to a very loud music concert, very loud. So 200 meters deep, low frequency sound, very common. It is found most commonly near shipping lanes. So this is largely noise generated by oceanic vessels. If we get up to higher frequencies, the intensity drops way down. So here, 200 hertz, that's a moderately high sound, and here, up to 800 hertz, that's a fairly high-pitched sound, so much lower in the decibel rating. So getting near the surface, the ambient oceanic sounds caused by traffic, things such as this, are at a frequency and intensity where they are not of themselves disruptive to the marine mammals. Not so, of course, of Navy sonars, and the Navy is supposed to watch to make sure when they're doing tests that they try to avoid areas where marine mammals are common. But if you need to find an enemy submarine, well, you need to find the enemy submarine. Well, the ocean, of course, is a resource, and one of the greatest resources of the ocean is a way to move stuff from one place to another, hardly ever spilling a container of rubber duckies into the ocean. And you can see the red shipping lanes. These are, of course, very common. There's a lot of I like that the captain is going to divert his course south. As I understand it, when you get further north up into these heavily traveled lanes, you're assigned a lane, and you don't have a lot of freedom as to just how much diversion you can take without confusing the traffic. So the world merchant fleet now is approaching 600 million tons carrying capacity, and about 90% of global trade uses the ocean to transfer from one place to another. As we get more and more able to travel through the Northwest Passage, you may see a lot of red lines coming through here. I heard that after Crystal went through there, the Canadian government got very interested in this, that they didn't want to encourage a lot more traffic going along these northern areas. So what's going to happen with restriction of traffic there is going to be interesting to follow. I showed this before. It's kind of fun to look where are your favorite ships. And I showed you the Sail WX info before, but also marinetraffic.com. A little more difficult to use, but once you learn how to use it, you can easily find where somebody is, where they've been. And if you're a pirate and you want to plan an assault on a ship, well, this could be a good source of information. Another important resource, of course, is fisheries. Fisheries have tripled since 1950 this isn't completely updated now, but the trend has continued. The rest of the world, the light blue, peaked up in the 90s and has declined slightly, not necessarily due to a lack of desire to bring in fish, but due to government controls on fishing, and it's just plain more difficult to catch a worthwhile fish. China has greatly increased and is still increasing their catch. If you've been through the South China Sea at night, if you look out, there's all these little lights like fireflies. And sometimes you get alongside, and there's a 22-foot boat with a canvas cover over the top. And I'm told the families live on there for a month or 2 months or more at a time. They fish and then drop their fish off at a factory ship. The trawlers you see there now, the trawlers getting larger and larger. They're even doing tandem trawling, where one trawler will align next to another trawler, and somehow they coordinate their nets so that they cut a wide swath through the water, dragging across the bottom, catching just about anything which is in their way. If we look at the stocks of the world, this is kind of similar to the graphs I showed for the Mediterranean. Exactly the same trend. Remember the Mediterranean being kind of a small model of the world oceans. Well, it's the same thing. On the bottom, the bright red, these are fisheries that have collapsed, and that keeps increasing. More and more fisheries. A collapsed fishery means nobody's fishing it. It's not worth it. You don't make a buck at all. Overexploited fisheries. These are fisheries where the catch is currently declining. Every year, less is caught. It takes more and more work to catch those species. Exploited. Now, exploited fisheries mean that now as some fisheries were becoming more and more difficult to fish, you begin to exploit different species of fish, different locations of those fish, different depths, different fishing gear. So more and more species being exploited every year, and now this is starting to flatten out. The reason is the developing fisheries, those that they're beginning to go and find a way to catch them, have decreased to very, very few. So there's hardly any fisheries left that are worth fishing and that we want to eat that haven't already been exploited. Encouraging, some of them are rebuilding, government regulations largely, and also that just not fishing the ones that have been terribly depleted, so that more and more fisheries are showing at least some recovery. What we've done, I mentioned this before, we're not only decreasing the numbers of individuals in these species, we're changing the species. We catch the individuals that are bold, that are out charging around and not running from any stimulus like an approaching net. So we're getting rid of the bold ones. We're ending up with more timid individuals. More timid individuals, behavioral work done on them shows that they're less able to feed well. They're not as bold as the other ones going around and grabbing whatever food they can. They're timid individuals, and they grow more slowly. They just don't reach the same size. So we're changing the species that we overexploit. One way around this is aquaculture. We can start growing the ones that we want to have to eat. So if we look at the colors in terms of how much aquaculture countries are doing, clearly China and Asia are the winners. India currently with 2 million and China with 28 million tons of aquacultured human consumable stocks per year. I found this other place where they put the size of the country according to its aquaculture output. China, even without the rest of Asia, clearly wins in the overall world. Their country is huge, if you will, for developing aquaculture. The rest of Asia comes along next, and the rest of our countries are really puny little strings compared to these countries. Now there's all sorts of controversy that, well, I don't want to eat pen-reared salmon. I don't like pen-reared salmon. I'll only eat wild-reared salmon. Some of this is a matter of developing the right stock, the right food to feed our aquacultured stocks, to give that salmon the nice red color and flavor that we so enjoy in the wild-caught salmon. But there's also a lot of controversy on aquaculture. Years ago, they wanted to bring a species into Hawaii from the Amazon, a species that grows up to like this big, and they said, we'll put it in freshwater ponds and raise the salinity a little. They're going to love it. And we promise they'll never escape into the rivers or the ocean. Our legislature, fortunately, had a nice sense of humor about that, and they said, right, you're not bringing it in. This problem, of course, persists and is very controversial with salmon aquaculture, bringing Atlantic salmon over to the Pacific, rearing them in pens. You will get salmon escaping from the pens. They will mix with the local stock. You will change the genetic structure of the stock of salmon when you do this. A friend of mine had a house on the river in Tasmania. They had what we would call a coconut wireless in Hawaii, a telephone network. When one of the salmon rearing farms upstream would tear the net and a large escaping group of salmon would be starting downriver, they'd call each other and everybody would be running out with whatever net they could find as the salmon traveled down. But it was a common enough event that they had this system set up to notify their neighbors downstream that it was coming. Oh, recreation. This is certainly another important resource for the ocean. $20 trillion industry worldwide. California estimated about $10 billion for coastal tourism. Florida, $16 to $53 billion for coastal tourism. $69 billion alone for the United States. These many different forms of recreation, one of the things you can certainly congratulate the cruise ship industry is being proactive in this. That is, working within their own organization to control their impact upon the environment. There are mistakes made. There are bilges that accidentally get pumped. Stuff happens. And the community that they're going by will respond, most definitely. But at least if without this internal regulation, things would be a lot worse. And government regulation would be coming up soon. Another important resource in the ocean, we're not really making much use of it, manganese nodules, the minerals, manganese, copper, and nickel primarily. It's estimated that somewhere around 500 billion tons are found at the bottom of the ocean from 4,000 to 6,000 meters deep. Now, in the 60s and 70s, there were some mining consortiums forming to begin to explore the exploitation of these manganese nodules. Did anybody here invest in one? Don't be ashamed. I won't point to you. Well, they were available. I didn't have any money, so I couldn't have invested. I might have if I had a little money to put into it. But there's little interest now. Nickel production is up. International laws were making it very difficult to think about how do I get permits to mine out in the open ocean. And the costs were too high. And China, for one, was supplying a lot of the rare minerals that you would be getting from the manganese nodules. Well, a funny thing happened in Hawaii. All of a sudden, the Glomar Explorer showed up, 1974. The Glomar Explorer was in Hawaii to develop experimental methods for manganese nodule mining. And everybody paid a lot of attention to this because involved in the middle of it was our good friend Howard Hughes. So hey, if Howard thinks this is a going possibility, maybe we should take a look at this. Of course, the interesting thing that happened, the same time, oceanography at the University of Hawaii got huge growth, just huge. We gained a dean of marine science. We got all these new faculty positions in marine biology and oceanography. So it was a heyday at the University of Hawaii. Well, it turned out that our new dean of marine science actually worked for the CIA. And the Glomar Explorer, as you know, wasn't there for manganese nodule mining. She was there to try to retrieve the Russian sub that was sunk south of Hawaii, which they successfully did retrieve part of it. So this was a big splash for manganese nodule mining, and then bleh, it fell apart again. Now, if there is manganese nodule mining on a large scale, it will destroy the deep water communities. Communities like this that would take hundreds of years to develop, even little trees like this. All sorts of these things are very old. We know very little about what happens in the depths of the ocean. Dan showed you some of the black smokers and things like this in the hydrothermal vents. All sorts of really cool animals found down there, like the ghost octopus, things such as this. Well, these could be completely replaced by massive mining operations. So here's the current proposals. Having a surface vessel and remote operated vehicles on the bottom of the ocean, cutting swaths across it. Another one would come along and suck up the bottom, transport it over to a pumping station. It would get pumped up to the ship for processing, and somewhere around 98% of what was pumped up would be dumped over the side to fall back down. I think you can see that this will be rather intrusive to the marine environment. You might look at this and say, well, this looks like science fiction to me. I don't think it's going to be happening tomorrow. Move on to something else. Then you see they're building it already. So this is a machine being built. This is the cutter. There's two men. You can see the size of this thing. So this would automatically, remote controlled, be cutting, plowing, if you will, the bottom of the ocean, cutting things up into small chunks, and then the sucker would come behind the cutter and send it up to the surface. So people are investing in this. I think we will see it happening most definitely. Now, I've got a whole lecture on coral reefs, so I'm not going to get into it here, but the coral reef is another very important resource, not just for recreation, but many chemical extracts have been made by looking at the coral reef community. Histamines, hormones, antibiotics, secosteroids have helped develop drugs like AZT, ARA-A, ARA-C, Dolostatin 10, many of these things which combat AIDS. I have a friend who spends his entire time in the South Pacific going out diving or snorkeling, looking for stuff he hasn't seen before, collecting it, throwing it in a bag, freeze-drying it, and sending it off to Bethesda, Maryland, to the NIH, where it's screened usually for cancer-inhibiting characteristics.